powers of attorney. And it's now my pleasure to introduce you to our first speaker, the Community Education Coordinator for Seniors' Rights Victoria, Gary Ferguson. We hope you enjoy our session today. Thank you.
Okay, so I just want to check to make sure that the library people can hear me. Yes, great.
I'll just move that one more time.
Can you hear me now? Yep. All right. Okay. As Judith said, my name is Gary Ferguson and I'm the Community Education Coordinator for Seniors' Rights Victoria. I've been working with Seniors' Rights Victoria since it was first set up in 2008, and my main function is to, with a group of volunteers, deliver community education sessions like this around elder abuse, the risks, what you can do to prevent it, and what we provide at Seniors' Rights Victoria, and also to deliver professional education to people who are working in the field, and particularly those who are working with older clients. And we run quite a lot of professional education as well. Now, during the course of the talk, what I'm going to say is when we're talking about Seniors' Rights Victoria is that our services are free. So there are no charges for any of these sessions, and it's fairly important to understand that, and that all of the services we provide on a one-to-one basis are confidential. All right, so what I'm going to talk about today, I just have to make sure the slides are slipped. Okay, is I'm going to talk about, as I said earlier, elder abuse, risks and prevention, and what assistance and support is available to people who find themselves in this particular situation. Now, before I launch into this, I'm going to set a particular context, but one of the things I want to say is that what we see at Seniors' Rights Victoria are people over 60 years of age mostly who are being subjected to some form of abuse. So it's important to understand that that's the context in which this talk is pitched, and that it's important also to realise that in a lot of families this will never occur. You know, we might have disagreements and tensions and conflicts between family members, and they get resolved in some way, maybe not to everyone's liking. Certainly that happens in my family, but that doesn't lead to elder abuse. And you know, and what we see at Seniors' Rights Victoria is when people are being subjected to elder abuse. So it's important to remember that particular context. All right. Now, before I get underway, the other thing to say is that this is not legal advice. There will be some legal information in the first part of the session, but I am not a lawyer and this is not legal advice. So if you have specific issues related to this first part of the session and you want to talk about those, you can either talk to me or Pam during the break, or if you're not in this site, then contact us on the telephone line, which I will give you towards the end of this talk. All right. Now, what I want to talk about first is Australia's population, because that sets a particular context for the way we work. And in Australia, in 2011, there was a census conducted, and what they found in the census was that there was 21.5 million people living in Australia. And of the 21.5 million people living in Australia, 5.5 million people lived in Victoria. And of those, about 14% are over 65 years of age. And what we know is that by 2021, that will increase to about 20 to 25%. And so what that will mean is that 1 in 5 people in Victoria will be over 65 years of age. So, you know, if you don't already know, what's happening in Australia is that the population is aging rapidly. People are living longer and they're living more healthy lives. And just because a person retires doesn't mean that they actually stop participating in the community. People over 65 years of age continue to contribute to the community in very valuable ways. One of those ways is through volunteerism. So it's important to recognise that as well. Now, of the 14% of people in Victoria who are over 65 years of age, about a third of those are from culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds. So in Victoria, for example, at the moment, what we're seeing is that the two biggest groups of people over 65 years of age are Italians and Greeks. And that reflects the migration program that occurred in Australia after World War II. The other thing to say is that there is about 38,000 people living in Victoria who are from Aboriginal backgrounds. And about just over 1,600 of those are over 65 years of age. So that's about 4% of the Aboriginal population. Now, the reason I talk about Australia's population at the beginning, and people over 65 years of age particularly, is because that's the context in which Seniors Rights Victoria works. And it's important to understand that as we're going through the presentation today. Okay, so what I'm going to talk about now is elder abuse. And elder abuse has a particular definition. It is several forms of mistreatment of an older person that is committed by someone with whom they have a relationship of trust. And that relationship of trust could be with a family member, could be with a partner, it could be with a close friend, or it could be with a close neighbour. But it's important to recognise a little bit about the definition of the relationship of trust. In the relationship of trust for our work, there can be no consumer transaction or professional association. So if someone came along to us and said, for example, that they're seeing a particular doctor and they wanted to make a complaint about that doctor, because there's a fee being paid there, that wouldn't come under our brief. And so what we would do is refer that person to where they could make a complaint about the doctor. What we were set up to do about 6 years ago was to work with people over 60 years of age who were experiencing elder abuse and where that relationship of trust had no consumer transaction or professional association. And in most circumstances, in the work that we do, what we see is that the abuse and mistreatment of the older person is occurring because of the actions or behaviour of another family member or relative. And usually that family member will be between 40 and 55 years of age. And in nearly half of the situations, it will be the adult son or the adult daughter. Now, researchers in Australia estimate that about 2 to 5% of people over 65 years of age will experience this type of abuse at some point. And when we talk about this, what I'd like you to think about is not always that it's an extreme form of abuse. It can start off very subtly. And we'll talk about examples as we go through the talk. And the other thing is to say that the arrangement may have actually started as a result of an agreement that was reached between the older person and the family member. And that might have started out okay, but as time's gone on, it's become a little bit more difficult. Okay, are there any questions about the definition?
The context is within the relationship of trust now. Outside the relationship of trust, is it
all right, I can repeat the question. So the question here, for those people in the library who didn't hear it, is outside the relationship of trust, can the person make a complaint elsewhere if they're being abused or mistreated? And the answer to that is yes. You know, there are authorities and various agencies that deal with complaints of that nature. And so if someone came to us with a complaint like that, we would refer them and give them information where they can take that complaint. All right, so what the next slide is showing you is that obviously people don't come and tell us that they're experiencing elder abuse. And some of you today may have been hearing this term for the first time. Could we just go back to the previous slide? And so what we find is that people use a whole different range of words and phrases to describe this. You know, and it might be that they come and tell us, you know, that someone's tricked them into signing a document that they didn't know what it was about at the beginning, or that someone is constantly coming and insulting them, or ignoring them, or mistreating them, or family members have said that they would care for the older person and they're neglecting them. So they describe this in different ways. And what I'm going to talk about now is the different types of elder abuse that we see at Seniors Rights Victoria and the different definitions. Okay. So the first one is emotional and psychological abuse, which is any actions or behaviours or words that devalue an older person. So this usually happens over a period of time, and it can be things like, it's things usually that make the older person feel devalued. They might make them feel despondent or depressed. So it could put the older person down. It might humiliate them, like phrases like, well, you're getting older now, what would you know, you're losing your marbles? Because, obviously, there's a stereotype of older people and, as people get older, well, they lose their marbles. And we know that that's not the case. Not everybody will lose capacity as they get older. So it could be things like that that's said over a period of time. It might be threatening the older person. It might be things like stopping access to grandchildren, for example. So all of these things can have an emotional and psychological impact on the older person. The next type of abuse is social abuse, which is stopping an older person from having contact with other people or with services. So usually, just to give you an idea of how this might occur and in what setting, it might be that the older person has agreed that an adult son or daughter can come home and live with them because the adult son or daughter is facing a crisis. That crisis might be a relationship breakdown. It might be that they've got a gambling problem or a substance use problem or an alcohol problem. Mum or dad's protective instinct has kicked in and they've said, yep, look, you've got a problem, come home and stay and until you sort the problem out. And that's quite a natural response for a mother or father. The adult son or daughter moves in, and what they start, the arrangement might start off okay, and what they begin to do is they begin to answer all the knocks that come to the door. They might answer all the telephone calls that come, and they start making excuses why mum or dad's not available. They might tell services that they're not needed anymore, and so what mum or dad finds is that the contact that they're having with people outside of the home becomes less and less. And usually this will occur in the context where the adult son or daughter is abusing the older person in another way. So they might be abusing them financially and not wanting anybody outside to know that that's occurring. All right, the next type of abuse is sexual abuse, which is any sexual behaviour or action that is perpetrated without a person's consent. So, what we see reported in the media is, extreme cases of this, which is sexual assault and sexual rape. Now, what we know in the community is that generally sexual abuse goes underreported. And it's the same in elder abuse. This type of abuse is underreported. In the 6 years that we've been in existence, we've probably had less than 20 cases of this. And we don't see usually extreme cases of it. What we would see are more subtle representations of this. So to give you an example, we had a grandmother who was 80 years old, who because of particular family circumstances had agreed that her 2 grandsons could live with her. They were 18 and 21, and they weren't studying and they weren't working. So they moved in with the grandmother, and what they were doing was they were home all day and they were drinking alcohol a lot. And they set their computers up in her living room, and what they were looking at on the computers all day was sexually explicit images. Now, she felt very uncomfortable about that. She'd lived in this house for 40 years, and she had invited people over, and because of that, she felt very embarrassed and ashamed. She asked them to move them to the bedroom, the computers, and they refused. So as a result of that, she stopped inviting friends over. When she asked them to leave the house, because they wouldn't agree to moving the computers to the bedroom, they refused to do that as well. So eventually, she found herself confined to her bedroom because of that. So it can be things like that as well. All right. Financial abuse is the illegal or improper use of a person's assets, property or money. Now, this can range from things like, items of value. So, a lot of older people will have things that may have been in the family or that they've had for a number of years, like gold watches, jewellery, they might have tools, they might have artwork, things of that nature. You know, it could be a dinner set, for example. And while it might not have much value to other people, it has very sentimental value to the older person. And they may not be using them. And someone might think, a family member might think, well, you know, I'm going to get that in the will. I'll take it now because mum or dad's not using it. And they don't ask mum or dad. So it can be things like that through to major deception or fraud. You know, so we had a gentleman whose first language wasn't English, and some years ago he had signed a document on the hearsay of his adult daughter, which she had told him was to go guarantor for a loan for $10,000. Now, he had relied on her to translate documents for him over a number of years, and she'd done that faithfully and honestly, until on this particular occasion, what she put in front of him was the transfer of the title of his house to her and her husband so that they could put it against a business proposition. So it can be major deception and fraud like that as well. Physical abuse is any action or behaviour that causes the older person hurt, pain or injury. So, you know, we know that as we get older, we can't enjoy the same knocks and bumps that we could when we were 30 years of age, playing tennis or football or whatever. Okay? So a knock or a bump now, you know, can do a lot of hurt and injury to the older person. And if that's done over a period of time, it can actually make the older person quite injured. And some people will do that. You know, they'll push or shove the older person constantly to instill fear into them. They might be aggressive around them. It might be those sorts of things. And the final type of abuse is neglect, which is the failure to provide the older person with the necessities of life. So, you know, this could be things like the older person is relying on someone to provide them with medication. That's not being provided by the carer. It could be that the older person relies on someone to provide meals for them, and that's not being provided. There may have been an arrangement set up, which is what we see a lot, where the older person has sold their property, taken the money from that property and invested it into the property of an adult son or daughter on the arrangement that that adult son or daughter is going to provide care for the older person. The arrangement's set up, and what happens is the care's not provided. You know, and so we would see that quite a lot. It's often referred to, that arrangement, as a granny flat arrangement. All right, so they're the 6 types of abuse. So what do you think, and I'm interested in the people in the library as well. I was going to say library people, but the people in the library as well. What do you think is the most common type of abuse that we see at an organisation like Seniors Rights Victoria? Financial, someone here has said financial. Others? Emotional? Others? What do others think? Emotional? What about the library people? What do you think? Can we hear them? Neglect? Okay. The most common type of abuse that we've seen over a number of years at Seniors Rights Victoria is usually financial abuse. It constitutes about up to 40% of the casework that we do. And most other organisations in Australia would experience the same sort of prevalence. But closely with that, we see a lot of psychological and emotional abuse. And usually when someone comes to us with a primary concern, what we find is that they'll be psychologically and emotionally abused as well. So we never ever see one type of abuse on its own. All right. So I just want to talk now, you know, the most important thing is that if this is happening to you or you know of it happening to someone else, it's important to get them to talk about it. And it's very difficult for people to talk about these things. You know, these are some of the reasons why people may not talk about it. They're not all of the reasons. They may think that if they talk about it, they'll be punished. You know, that the person who's abusing them will, you know, increase the abuse, that they will be more abused as a result of that. They may think that if they talk about it, you know, that they will be abandoned or rejected, particularly if they're reliant on one person providing the care for them. They may think that, if they go and talk about it to someone, about that person won't be available anymore and they won't get the care and support that they need. Family loyalties and codes can stop people from talking about this sort of thing. When I was growing up, one of the things that I used to do with the rest of my family was my grandparents and my grandmother particularly would have a regular Sunday lunch for all of the family. All of the family would come, the cousins, the aunts, the uncles, and everybody went along. And there'd be a big roast cooked by my grandmother, and it was a great day for people to come together. And one of the things you did was you never missed it, because if you missed it, you got gossiped about, you see? So people would talk about you if you went there. And the other reason you didn't miss it was because if you missed it, you didn't find out the gossip about the people who weren't there. So you had to turn up, you see, to find out about the family gossip. But one of the things my grandfather would say to us is, what happens in the family and is said in the family stays in the family, and you don't talk about it to anybody outside. And as children, that instilled fear in us. But as adults, if that sort of thing is happening to us, we need to talk about it outside. It's important not to observe those family codes and not to be ashamed about it or feel guilty about it. If a person's being abused, it's not their fault. They may have told someone, the person might have told someone and no one listens to them. They might have said, well, I know John or I know Jane and they're very good children and they could never do anything like that. Right? And then if that's the response that the older person's getting, then they're not likely to go and talk to someone like Seniors Rights Victoria about it. They may be unaware of the options. They may think, well, if I go and talk to someone about this, then the police will get involved and my family member will go to jail. If someone comes to Seniors Rights Victoria, we give them a range of options that they can choose for their particular situation. And that usually doesn't involve the police. All right. So what increases the risk? In a lot of the cases we see, there are alcohol and drugs involved, and that's usually that's occurring for the adult son or the adult daughter. And the mother or father is trying to address this or to assist the adult son or daughter, but because of that problem, it's actually become quite abusive. And we're seeing a little bit more increase in people who've got gambling problems as well. If the older person is dependent upon the person who's abusing them entirely, then that can make it very difficult for them to actually do anything about it. And they may think that there are no options. So that can increase the risk. And that's usually associated with isolation, that the older person isn't connected in some way with the neighbourhood or with the community. Sometimes we'll see that someone's caring for an older person and they're experiencing stress as a result of that, and as a result of that, it's become abusive. But overall, what we see is that there's an imbalance of power, that, the older person has had taken away from them the power and control that they had possessed all through their life by another person. And that's usually what increases the risk and what's in play here. So, obviously what we want is that people will do things to prevent this. And that's really what part of today's session is about. So, we want people to plan for the future. And people say to me, well, I'm 70 years old, how can I plan for the future? Well, you can. We get up in the morning and we decide whether we're going to come to a seminar like this or not. That's planning for the future. We decide whether we're going to visit, a relative or a friend or go to a group or go down to the library. That's planning. And the more you're doing that, the more you're connecting with other people. And equally, we'd ask you to plan in terms of, having documents in place which protect your interests, like enduring powers of attorney. And Pam is going to talk about that in a moment. Remain active, and I'm not saying that, you have to go and run a marathon, but if you want to do that, that's entirely up to you and we'd support you in that, okay? We drive alongside you while you're running the marathon. But it means actually, remaining active in the community and in your neighbourhood. If you don't want to belong to a group, that's fine, but you can actually connect with people in the neighbourhood as well. Stay independent, whatever that takes. You know, some people can stay independent and live adequately in their own homes with support services coming in to assist them to do that. And if that's what it takes, then do that. And also, if you know, whatever it takes for you to be and feel safe should be okay. You know, when my grandparents retired, they decided that they weren't going to open the door after 9 o'clock at night, regardless of who came knocking. Now, we thought as children that that was ridiculous. You know, we laughed at them. But for them, it made them feel safe. So it's important that if you feel like doing things like that, and it's okay for you, you do it, regardless of what other people are saying. And if you have issues of concern, talk about them early. Because the earlier you talk about them, particularly if it relates to elder abuse, the better redress you can get. All right. So before I launch into what we do at Seniors Rights Victoria, let me take some questions. Are there any questions? We're just giving the microphone to someone in the audience here so that people in the library can hear it. I'll repeat the question. Yep.
What legislation is in place to enforce what you can do for seniors?
Okay. So the question here is, what legislation is in place to enforce what we can do for seniors? There's no specific elder law legislation in place, but there would be a range of legislation that we might actually use in addressing some of these issues. So for example, you know, one of the things that we might use is intervention orders, for example, which come under a legislation. So it just depends on what course the older person wants to take and also what's available to us. Yeah?
So are there plans for the government to look to what's being done in other countries to follow, to adopt some legislation or control?
All right.
For example, in Singapore, there is legislation that compels children to provide for care. But we don't do it here.
All right. So the question here is the government looking at legislation in other countries? And the example was given in Singapore. There's legislation requiring children to look after their older parents. Look, as far as I'm aware, no. They might be looking at broader legislation that exists in other countries. For example, in Australia, there's no mandatory reporting of elder abuse, but in the United States of America, there is. So there is some discussion at the moment in Australia around whether that sort of legislation will be adopted here. Yeah? All right. Are there any questions in the library? No. Oh, yes? Oh, yes?
Right. Being a pensioner, if husband and wife both only staying in the house and the neighbors' children disturb them, come and knock the door all the time and break the post box and throw the eggs on the doorsteps, on the windows, what to be done?
Well,
Really?
I have to tell you firstly that that doesn't fit into our definition of what we talked about at the beginning. But my advice to you would be to possibly contact the police.
I see. It's no, not to contact the council or no one is going to help from the council.
Have you contacted the council previously?
No, I didn't. But I'm thinking when I'm hearing this, if some support will be given to the seniors if they are troubled by the children.
Yeah, the council staff here are saying contact the police as well.
Yeah.
Okay.
I heard that yesterday night already.
Yeah.
And the 14-year-old came and he was banging my fence and I told him not to bang it, it breaks. He said, don't worry, that's his fence. And I didn't say anything. I came inside the house and sitting. Then within 20 minutes, I had a sound. It broke my letterbox. And then I had 3 or 4 eggs just thrown on my door. And it was there. Then I rang to the police, but they didn't come. And I still waited 9:30 in the night. Again, I had 3 eggs in the front glass windows. Then I rang to the police again. Then he came. Then police cleaned that in the front window, and I said, it's very dark, I can't do it, I will do it next morning. He said, no, it will be dried and it will be very hard to take it out. Then they did the cleaning, and he told me he went to the neighbor's house. He said he's going to tell the boy if he's doing that next time, they'll put him in the jail.
All right. It doesn't, for our purposes, it actually doesn't constitute elder abuse. And the reason it doesn't, let me just explain this, is that it doesn't constitute a relationship of trust with those neighbours. So that's why I'm saying to you, you need to keep going back to the police.
I see.
Yeah? Because it's criminal damage. Yeah? Yeah, but I don't think that, yeah. I mean, the other suggestion here is contact the Justice Department that deals with neighbourhood disputes, but that's more a mediation service, I think. And, you know, maybe it's beyond mediation. Can we just leave that there, because it really is beyond our brief? And, yep, okay. All right, I'm going to move on to Seniors' Rights Victoria, and I'm just aware of the time now. We have a telephone helpline, which is 1300 368 821. Can I just check that they've got the postcard? Okay, so the people in the library, you should have a postcard, and we've got a postcard here as well as a pamphlet, and on the back of those is the telephone number. The telephone number operates 10 a.m. to 5 p.m. Monday to Friday, and when you call our telephone helpline, a person answers the phone. It's not a push-button menu, all right, so you don't have to push 1 for sales or 2 for accounts, and it's not one of those dreadful computers on the other end which asks you to speak clearly in the phone and then doesn't recognise your voice. It's a person. And the person is in our Melbourne office. All right? And what they will usually do is they'll take some details from you and they'll work out whether it's elder abuse or not. And if it is elder abuse, then what they will do is they will either get a lawyer on the phone straight away, or they'll book an appointment with you to call back at another time, either that day or the following working day. Now, when you speak to someone at our service about elder abuse, it's both the lawyer and the advocate who'll be listening. And the reason we do that is so that the person doesn't have to keep telling the story over and over again. Now, people might decide that they don't want legal redress, and that's okay. That's why we have the advocate who can come up with some non-legal solutions. So let me just take you back. You remember the grandmother, the 80-year-old grandmother with the 2 grandsons? She asked them to leave and they wouldn't. All right, so she called us and she told us her story, which is basically what I told you. And she said that she wanted the grandsons to leave the house. So we gave her a range of options. The first option was, we will write a legal letter on legal letterhead representing your interests to both of your grandsons, asking them to leave the property by a certain date. Or we'll come and pick you up and we'll take you down to the local court and we'll make an application for an intervention order. We'll get them off the property and they won't have any contact with you ever again. And some other options as well. Right? So what we're doing is we're giving the older person the options to make choices about their particular situation. What she said to us after we gave her the options was she wanted to keep the relationship with her grandsons. Right? So she wanted them out, but she still wanted to have a relationship with them, which was understandable. So what that meant was that she couldn't, we couldn't get an intervention order because that meant she wouldn't have any contact with them. So what we did was we arranged to write a legal letter on legal letterhead asking them to leave the property by a certain date. It was about 2 weeks from the time we sent the letter. The problem was that it put her at risk, potentially. They're in her house, they're going to get the letters there, they could become violent and aggressive. So before we sent the letter, our advocates worked with her to develop a safety plan. And that safety plan enabled her to identify someone she could go to in the event that they became violent. We sent them the letter. 2 weeks later, we rang on the day that they were supposed to leave. One of the grandsons picked up the phone and told our lawyer in very colourful terms they weren't leaving. All right? And so what we did then was we knew she had a safety plan. We hung up. We rang again on the Monday after the weekend. She picked up the phone and what she told us was they left on the Sunday. They did the typical thing that 18 and 21-year-olds do. They left when they were ready, not when we were telling them. All right? So they moved them out of the house. She continued to have a relationship with them. And, you know, it's not ideal, but she does have some form of relationship. So that gives you an idea of how we work. Can we just go back to the other slide? We have a community education program as well, and 4 free clinics that operate in Melbourne. The one closest to here is at Bundoora Extended Care. All right, it's a free clinic, and they operate separately from us. They're staffed by volunteer lawyers, and they provide a whole range of advice around things like, if you're thinking about going into a retirement village and you want someone to explain the contract to you, they will help you do that. All right? These community education talks are available to seniors groups. So if you belong to a group and you want to talk like this, then we can arrange it. You just contact the telephone helpline. And like I said at the beginning, we do provide training to professionals as well. And we do have a website. Okay. This is going to continue to be a growing issue. You know, as I said at the beginning, Australia's population is ageing. And what we would anticipate is, regardless of whether the percentage increases or not, as the population ages, we will see more incidences of elder abuse. So the best way to stop it and to make it unacceptable is to talk about it. You know, to continue to create awareness and support those who are being abused. And that way, we develop community responses, a bit like domestic violence. You know, 20 years ago, 30 years ago, nobody wanted to know about domestic violence. Now, as a society, we haven't addressed it all, but we certainly say it's unacceptable. And we have a whole lot of measures in place that support women who are being abused in that way. Similarly, we can do the same for our seniors in the community by talking about it. Thank you very much to you all for coming along today and for being attentive. I'll have a few minutes for questions and then we're going to have a break. Any questions?
This would be huge. Could this be taught at the schools as well?
Yeah, there is some, like in some other countries, they do teach this sort of thing around in the schools, but they do it in a more positive way. It's intergenerational. So they get seniors to go in and talk about ageing and, you know, and get them to do projects with kids in schools so that kids have a different aspect of, you know, of older people. We're doing a project here at the moment in Bendigo where a group of students who are studying photography at one of the local colleges is working with older people to photograph them and tell their stories, and they're going to create an exhibition of that. So that's sort of, you know, while it doesn't sort of directly deal with the issue of elder abuse, what it does is it actually, you know, gives people an experience of older people that's far different from that negative image that they might have. Yeah? No. Yes, that's right. Yeah, that's right. And look, and for some families, that's what will happen. We'll say, are you aware of this? And they'll say, no, I wasn't aware of that. And once they do become aware, then they stop it. So it's not always, we're not always taking legal action. It's really about, you know, fostering more harmonious relationships between the older person and the person who might be abusing them. All right, I'm going to stop there. We're going to have about a 10 or 15-minute break, and then our community lawyer, Pam Morton, is going to talk about enduring powers of attorney. Thank you very much.